Hi, my name is Sahar Joakim, and I'm recording the following video in honor of America's 250th birthday. This is a lecture that was originally provided to the city of Manchester on June 14th, 2026, called The Bill of Rights, The Meaning of Freedom. We're going to start with 1776, which is when Americans, the people who were in the 13 colonies, not yet called quite Americans, established that they no longer wanted to be the subjects of the British Empire. And so they formed what's called a Declaration of Independence, essentially people saying that they are no longer going to be subjects. Now, when you look at the period between 1776, that Declaration of Independence, and the 1787 Constitutional Convention, that's about 11 years. And the Articles of Confederation is what governed the people who were in the now called the United States of America. So I want to go through some of that history before diving into the virtues that went into this. When we established the American empire or country, whatever you want to call it, the republic, so to speak, it wasn't only a political revolution. It wasn't just the establishment of a new nation with new laws. It was also a philosophical revolution. And so when you look at the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, it is conveying a different view on government and governing that had been seen by these people, by the French, by the Spanish, by the German, or by the Europeans in general, especially the British. There was no idea that the governing powers had to get any kind of consent from the people they were going to govern. And so, one of the new ideas is that the people who are going to be governed are actually going to make legitimate whatever powers the governing people have. The second change, that was a philosophical change or revolution, is that rights must be explicitly protected. And so, in the old world, so to speak, Europe in large, but also the Chinese and Middle Eastern nations, as well as all over the Java. The idea was that the people who are going to allow you to do something will decide when and what you're allowed to do. But in the United States of America, the Bill of Rights being added to the Constitution meant that what the people who are governed are allowed to do, their rights, will be written down and known, positive rights and negative rights. And the third idea is that the government is telling you that the government will not be a tyrant. And we have seen this idea before, especially if you look at the Cyrus cylinder, but it was still a very much philosophical change from the European way of life. When you look at the Declaration of Independence, it says a bunch of things, but I want to read to you the part in red that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, so unalienable. Alien is something that's foreign or different. And so if you have unalienable rights, it's something that cannot be foreign to you. It cannot be separate from you or independent from you. So if you have unalienable rights, that means that there are certain things that you're allowed to do or that you're not allowed to be stopped from doing that cannot be separated from you. That you are born with them, you don't have to earn them, you can't lose them. And then it goes on to say what some of those rights are, like, for example, liberty. And so I want to talk to you about the meaning of liberty or freedom, which I don't believe are truly the same thing. The Declaration of Independence goes on to say that the governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so that's one of the philosophical revolutions among European settlers here in the United States of America, is that they believed that when you have a government, the government is going to tell the people who are governed what to do, but that the people who are going to be subordinate or subjects are actually the people who are truly in charge because they are going to somehow put the government in their governing positions. And some of these ideas that were written down by one of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, out of Virginia, is highly inspired by the philosopher John Locke. And so Thomas Jefferson's mentor was highly influenced by John Locke and a lot of other philosophers. So when we're looking at the 1787 Constitutional Convention, What's happening is that representatives from the 13 colonies are getting together to move away from the government that they had established to govern themselves after they declared themselves independent from the British government. And so the Articles of Confederation is something that we should discuss. As soon as the Declaration of Independence was published and distributed, the people in the 13 colonies saw themselves as independent from the British, and so they tried to govern themselves. And this is called the Articles of Confederation. There was no central government. So there was economic chaos because the 13 colonies weren't treating the other 12 colonies as sort of their equals. There was no shared money or currency. They weren't able to, as the 13 colonies united, defend themselves from either the British that were controlling Canada or from the indigenous people who were trying to take back the land that was just stolen from them. And there was lots and lots of problems with the Articles of Confederation, including the fact that there was just one kind of governing body, as opposed to what we have now, where we have the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. Like they had one group of people who were trying to come up with the laws, who were trying to enforce the laws. There were no, as we would say, checks and balances. And so the Articles of Confederation were the first attempt at governing the 13 colonies, but it had a lot of problems from economic to military. And so one of the problems here is that the 13 colonies were not united, which leads to this idea of the United States. It's truly the United Colonies. So, as you can see in this map, the 13 colonies was nothing to the left of or to the west of the Mississippi River. And each of those 13 colonies were operating as like separate countries, essentially, separate states. And so, what happened at that constitutional convention that was called for by leaders from all the 13 colonies, almost every single 13 colony had a representative there. The change was that they were going to start not only being independent from the British, but they were going to be united as the 13 colonies. And so we have 55 delegates that are called the founding fathers, but there are not 55 people who signed the Constitution after that constitutional convention. So there was tons of debate about what exactly the Constitution should say, mainly written by Thomas Jefferson and highly influenced by several people. There were still debates left unsettled. And so many people who are called founding fathers because they were at the Constitutional Convention, they were highly influential debaters, still thought that the Constitution was incomplete. And so they didn't sign off on it, and their names aren't at the bottom of the Constitution. The main ideas of the Constitution that are actually in there are popular sovereignty, federalism, separation of powers, and checks, balances, republicanism. Now, you have to be careful with these words because just like it was not the Democrats who brought the end of slavery, but the Republicans, Republicans and republicanism means something very different today as compared to 17 something or 18 something. Federalism also means something very different today as opposed to what it did in 17 or 18 something. So we have to be careful with what these words mean. The main person who argued against the Constitution of the United States, that it was incomplete, was Patrick Henry. And he's also at the convention arguing heavily, and he's arguing for republicanism. And he's talking about this idea of the common good and that the people, the commoners, the masses should truly be in charge, making decisions about who's going to govern them and all sorts of things where the people actually have power, even though they're not the government. And Patrick Henry is called an anti-federalist. And he is one of the people who never signed the Constitution of the United States because he thought it was incomplete without a Bill of Rights. Now, the person who was arguing most influentially against Patrick Henry was James Madison, who's a very important figure as far as the Constitution and especially the Bill of Rights. He wrote some of those first amendments. And James Madison was opposed to the Bill of Rights for several reasons. But he thought, for example, that the idea that the Constitution doesn't already say that the people have rights is laughable, that they're implied in there. Of course, Patrick Henry's thought was you cannot have the rights of the people implied. It cannot be ambiguous. It needs to be explicitly stated in like a list of rights that the people have. In Europe, for example, the rights of the people is for the most part implied traditionally. But the United States of America was founded when the Bill of Rights were added with this idea that the rights of the people have to be explicit. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison also had this debate, and I think based on like letters that Thomas Jefferson was actually the person who convinced James Madison, not Patrick Henry, to have a Bill of Rights, and James Madison actually goes on to write some of those Bill of Rights. He proposes 17 amendments to the Constitution, some of which would become the Bill of Rights, and the Congress actually only approved 12 of the 17. And 203 years later, in 1992, the second idea that James Madison had proposed, once he finally agreed to have a Bill of Rights, was actually ratified. So it's now the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. So let's talk more about the Bill of Rights. And this is all about individual liberties. So your liberty or your freedom, your right, which those words are not interchangeable, have two major kinds. And so you would learn this kind of thing in like a philosophy of law sort of class. You have positive rights and you have negative rights, and they are both your rights, but they are working in opposite directions. Your positive rights are basically what you have to have. And so if you don't have them, you can demand that they be provided to you. So, for example, if water is a basic human right, then if you don't have access to water, water must be provided to you by the government. You would have a right to demand it be given to you. So if abortion is a right, that means a positive right. If you can't afford one, one has to be appointed to you, given to you for free at the cost of the people who fund the government. A negative right is quite the opposite. Not exactly the opposite, but it works contrary. Instead of what you would demand if you didn't have it already, this is what nobody can demand from you. Your negative rights is basically what nobody is allowed to do to you. And so this is like the don't trend on me sort of thing. If you have a negative right to a vaccine, that means that if you don't want one, no one's allowed to force you to get one. This would be a negative right. The Bill of Rights, that's the addition to the Constitution, is mostly a list of negative rights. These are things that though the government is going to tell you what to do, these are the things that they're not allowed to tell you to do. Okay, let's look through some of those amendments. So these are things that cannot be forced upon you. The first one is about no one can stop you from saying something you believe. Nobody can stop you from believing something about supernatural deities, powers, gods. Nobody can stop you from getting together with members of your society and even criticizing the government. These are, again, negative rights. So if you want to do these things, the government, who's allowed to tell you what to do, isn't allowed to stop you from doing these things. Second Amendment is the same thing. It's a negative right. If you want to have a firearm, no one, even the government who tells you what to do, is allowed to stop you from having one. It's not saying you have to have a religion. It's not saying you have to have a gun. It's not saying you have to peacefully protest. Negative rights are what you're not allowed to be stopped from doing if you choose to do it. These are amongst your civil liberties. You have the freedom, you have the right. So the Bill of Rights is mostly a list of negative rights, which are your freedom. I want to talk more about what freedom means. So let's go to a philosopher, Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, and he writes that there's only one innate freedom, and that's freedom. Sorry, there's only one innate right, and that's freedom. So in the Declaration of Independence, there's several unalienable rights that were endowed for every man who's created equal from their creator. And one of them is liberty. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it says in there. Now, Immanuel Kant is saying that the only right you are born with, innate means from birth, is freedom. And then he defines freedom as saying independence from being constrained by another's choice. And so this is that negative right. Freedom, to Immanuel Kant, is the idea that the decisions you make are yours to have made and that no one can require you to do something. And then he gives this disclaimer that as long as you're not infringing on somebody else's ability to control their own life. And so this word is built in autonomy, auton and nomos, meaning self-governing. Every individual is born, he thinks, with the right to govern themselves. So if you choose to elect somebody to be your governor, then that person gets to tell you what to do because you consented. You get to say if someone else is going to tell you what to do. And that's built into the Constitution of the United States as well as the Bill of Rights. The idea is that we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, are going to choose who's going to tell us what to do. But let's look at an actual president from the 1940s, Roosevelt, and he says that freedom cannot be bestowed, it must be achieved. So you have here an actual president of the United States saying basically, you are not born with freedom. Freedom is not your innate right. Instead, you have to work for it. You have to achieve it. And he goes on in a different speech to say that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. That if you are somebody who has needs, like you lack money or you lack food, then you cannot be free. There's something that's controlling you. So freedom in the idea or philosophy of an actual US president is not something that's inalienable. In fact, you can lack freedom if you're, for example, impoverished. It's a very interesting difference when you look at philosophers and you look at our founding documents of the United States, whereas if you look at an actual president. Here's an economist, an economist, who wrote in the 80s, The Ethics of Liberty. And to me, he's a philosopher. And he writes that freedom is the absence of invasion by another individual against a man's person or property, including like what you think, right? So here, Rothbard is more in line with the founding fathers than one of our US presidents, because here he's telling you that freedom is the idea that you're governing yourself, that no one is infringing upon your decisions. So when we look at the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, we find these ideas built in. They're in our guiding documents, and they're in line with many philosophers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant, as different as those two philosophers are. And the key ideas is that authority must come with consent. Now, this won't work all the time. For example, children didn't ask to be born and don't agree to listen to their parents, but the parents are nonetheless their authority in many ways. But when it comes to all reasonable people, leaving the children, maybe the very elderly, the sick, or etc., out of it, when it comes to most reasonable people in a country, the people who are governed by the people who are the government are the ones giving the people who are the government the power. And so consent of the governed is required, that a legitimate power or that just power, just, true, righteous authority is given to the governing people by the people who are governed. And you don't see this in many nations historically, and you don't see this in many nations today. And so when you think about the United States of America, you have people in America saying that they're oppressed and that they're not free. However, when you look at all of the individual liberties and the civil liberties that the people have in America right now in 2026, you don't see oppression. You don't see slavery to the government. Now, there are economic injustices, there are social, systematic injustices, there are profiling that will I mean, there are problems, But if you look at America historically during a time where there was true slavery, there were people who couldn't choose their name, their occupation, their outfit, their clothes, their medicine, who they slept with. And we don't have any of that today. If you look at today in other countries, for example, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, where women can't show their hair without potentially dying by the government, where people in China cannot criticize the government without potentially dying, where people in Afghanistan, women, cannot leave their house without permission, without potentially dying. America is currently a very free liberty place. I want to say liberal, but liberal gets confused with this idea of liberal versus republic, and those words mean absolutely nothing compared to what they should be meaning. And then the idea of protection of rights. So I'm at the top right here. The citizens of the United States are currently protected by a set of rights. For example, you're not allowed to be murdered by the government without due cause, without a process. Whereas if you look at other nations, Arab nations, the Chinese Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the government does not owe any citizen due process. So there are governments where the government decides which citizens will be murdered with no rights of that person established. Whereas, even if it's not, like, same thing with number one, even if it's not respected, those laws are written down. And so our founding fathers took great care to write down a governing process and procedure that would be freeing for the governed in the United States of America. We have, bottom left, limiting governmental power. Now, even though if it doesn't work, and even though a president could be impeached but then be president again, like, all these things are in practice faulty because people are faulty and corrupt. The system that has been laid out was not corrupt in its beginning. Changes have been made later, right? Like, if you look at the Electoral College, your vote does not vote an equal vote to any voter all the time. Like, it kind of depends. Where do you live, and how long have you lived there, and what do you believe? What does the community believe? And so we have issues with our current system, no doubt. But when you look at which countries are free, America is one of them. And I didn't speak about Benjamin Franklin, whereas I did in the presentation that I gave for the city of Manchester. If we looked at Benjamin Franklin, he has, in his last few speeches, these ideas where he thinks that the country, or the 13 colonies, are going in the wrong direction. But since he realizes that he is, basically, he says he's old, his experience as a lawyer and all of the history he knows doesn't mean that he knows better. And so there's this idea of humility and flexibility or adaptability built into some of our documents that were inspired by people like Benjamin Franklin, because he says, I'm going to vote for something because this is what the future politicians want. This is what the youth now wants for their future. And there's like beautiful quotes from Benjamin Franklin towards the end of his life. He's very philosophical. So I just want to share some of those things with you today. And in case anybody thinks that they are not actually free in the United States, all you need to do is go to a different country. Many other countries will help you realize that the people in general in the United States of America are currently enjoying a very liberal, free life with rights.